The point that we keep getting away from that I haven't had an opportunity to, and Stephan knows this as well as I do, if you're gaining, say, 4 pounds a year of fat, or let's say between 20 and 40, you've put on 40 extra pounds, so now you're obese, you're a nice, lean, healthy young guy in 20, like many of us were, and by the time you're 40, you've got 40 pounds of excess fat. That's the equivalent of putting in about 10 calories a day, storing about 10 calories a day into your fat tissue that you don't burn or metabolize. So you eat, say, 2,700 calories a day, half carbs, 35% fat, 15% protein, and 10 calories a day get trapped in your fat tissue. Less than a bite's worth of food, less than a sip's worth of beer. So the question we're actually trying to ask is, or answer, and this is, again, just my approach as a curious journalist with a science background, is how do we explain those 10 calories? Because when we talk about those obese women with starving children, all those obese women were doing was storing 10 or 20 calories a day, depending on how quickly they became obese. In those populations, it tends to happen quickly in their 20s. So we're asking this question, how do we, you've got a situation where we have to end up with 10 calories stuck in the fat cells every day. That's a 20, 30, 40 billion fat cells, so it's divided up very small. And is the brain somehow regulating that? Or again, is there a dysregulation in the body involving, pick your hormones, pick your enzymes, that somehow traps fat in the fat cells or prevents the fat from being used for fuel when it's released from the fat cells. And so if you think about it that way, like you let yourself go to seed. Today, Joe Rogan decides, I'm done. I'm going to do nothing but drink beer. And you might start drinking 5 beers a day. And over the course of 10 years, you get 20 pounds, and it's all here. That 20 pounds over the course of 10 years is still only about 20 calories. You might have added 800 calories of beer to your diet and stored 20 calories as fat. How does that happen? And why does it go here and not elsewhere? And as Stephan said, this is insulin-dependent fat tissue. So that's when we're talking about this, like this question, can somebody get fat during a famine? Or can they stay fat during a famine? All they have to do is hold on to 10 calories a day extra. If they're only eating 1,200, 10 get stuck in their fat cells, 1,190 is excreted or expended. It's not that hard to imagine. And there's nothing in the laws of physics that says it. So what could be dysregulated about their fat cells, even during a relative famine, not a complete famine, but a relative famine that might lead. And again, animal experiments, of which there are probably hundreds by now, different animal models, you can disassociate obesity from eating too much in the animals.
Can I pause you for a second?
Yeah.
So essentially you're saying that even if someone is taking in a good amount of calories, a smart amount of calories, 2,000 calories a day, if you're taking in these calories in the form of sugar, your body is going to take a certain percentage of them, even if you're getting enough food, and store it as fat. Whereas if you were taking in just protein and vegetables and things along those lines, your body would not do that.
Well, so this gets to the mechanism question and the evidence question.
So, but you're saying that, right? So you're saying that if two people are on the same diet, one of them is on 2,000 calories of chicken and fish and vegetables, and the other one is on 2,000 calories of milkshakes and sugary drinks and pasta and bullshit, that person is going to gain a certain amount of calories and just put them to fat,
right?
Regardless.
That's the hypothesis. And that hypothesis,
same activity.
This being a science, that hypothesis can be tested.
Yes.
And Stephan thinks it's been tested 80 times. I don't know,
so
dozens
Stephan,
of times. I think they've done a bad job of testing it, and we will both tend to reject the studies that we don't like when we define don't like by whether or not they got the answer we think is correct.
Your perspective is this is not the case. Your perspective is that, like, as you were saying in the study where they closely monitored these people's diets and they added additional fat and additional carbohydrates, that they both gained the same additional amount of weight.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, if Carrier's hypothesis is correct, you have to see different levels of fat gain. I mean, Gary,
was this a short-term study that they did?
it was short-term.
How short-term was it?
2 and 3 weeks.
Well, that's very short-term.
Yeah, it is very
Yeah.
short-term, but still,
Well, and again-
Gary says that insulin is the thing that gets fat in fat cells, and that, I mean, you would see some kind of difference. If insulin made any difference,
Well-
you should have seen some kind of effect, right?
Okay.
Some kind of difference in fat gain.
Well, actually, I don't want to start taking out charts, but this gets into insulin dynamics that was worked out. So over I promised I wasn't going to say oi.
Oi?
Oi on the show, but it's thanks to my Brooklyn-born mother, it's my programmed in. And the same is true. A lot of these overfeeding experiments do the same thing. So when they talk about overfeeding, they literally overfeed. So they kind of do a reasonable way of figuring out what you're eating. As Stephan said, they calculated how much energy they needed to stay in energy imbalance. And again, right there, that's a problem. Because one of the hypotheses says that energy balance is dependent on the macronutrient content of the food. So you're going to get a different level depending on what the macronutrient content is. And then
A different level
of what's necessary for energy balance.
Okay.
So the classic example is a study that's my not-for-profit funded that's been very controversial, where they got their subjects, this is David Ludwig and Kara Ebeling and their colleagues at Harvard and Boston Children's Hospital, and they did this study in Framingham, and they basically got subjects to lose 10 or 12% of their body weight, and then they randomized them to 3 different diets of 3 different macronutrient compositions, and they basically calculated their energy expenditure on the 3 different diets, which is kind of exactly what we're talking about, because if you want to be in energy balance, you feed people exactly what they're expending. And in that study, which was published a year ago, and they saw different levels of energy expenditure depending on the carbohydrate content of the diet. So the higher level of carbohydrates, this is trying to keep them in energy balance. The higher the carbohydrate, the lower the energy expenditure. The lower the carbohydrate, the higher the energy expenditure. So again, it's just whether or not they did the study right, who knows? Science is a compilation of a lot of studies, and we're trying to, address exactly this point. But merely building that into the experiment, we know what their energy expenditure should be. And then the point is when you increase, and part of the trick of doing science is to say, look, we have competing hypotheses, multiple hypotheses. And it's vitally important that you always keep the multiple hypotheses in mind when you're interpreting the study. So one hypothesis says it's how much they eat, and another hypothesis says it's what they eat, and that what they eat is moderated primarily through insulin. And when you do these experiments, like the experiment that Stephan is talking about, Stephan, now I'm completely confused. If you overfeed them, you start out with a 50% carb diet, now you overfeed them. If there's a threshold effect on insulin, which it turns out there is, then you're just moving them. And when you look at insulin dynamics, when insulin is below a very low point, the fat cells will mobilize fat and the lean tissue will burn it for fuel. And above that point, you get pretty much flat. So if you start people who are eating 1,500 calories from carbs, and you bump them up to 2,500 calories from carbs, you're still in the plateau side of the insulin. You wouldn't necessarily expect to see any difference. The only way you expect to see a difference, and this is why it helps to really interrogate both hypotheses so that you know when you're doing the experiment whether or not you're actually testing something one hypothesis. You want to set up the experiment so the two hypotheses predict something entirely different. This experiment, arguably the two hypotheses predict the same thing. You'll get fat gain because insulin is elevated regardless. And when insulin is elevated, you're going to get fat gain. The question comes back to, if this, again, always vital to keep this in mind, what could possibly cause a 10 or 20 calorie excess that causes fat storage? I have a friend who was 400 pounds when he was 18. He was a tall kid, about 6'5". he was, say, 200 pounds overweight. 200 pounds overweight is roughly 100 excess calories over 18 years stored in your fat cells. That's, even if you assume that you have to consume 300 calories to have 100 excess stored in your fat cells, that's, 2 Coca-Colas a day that he was drinking, or half a quarter pounder a day that he was eating that his lean friends weren't. And the question would be, why can't he just stop doing that? And again, Stephan would say because his brain won't let him. And I would say because his insulin is elevated, it doesn't matter whether he stops it or not.
Can I respond here?
He's got to address
Please.
the underlying mechanism.
Okay. All right. So now, again, it's easy to tell stories. It's not easy to tell stories that are supported by scientific evidence. Now, I want to bring people's attention to reference number 11 on my site. There have been 29 studies now that have measured differences in energy expenditure, metabolic
Is this the
rate.
Kevin Hall study?
Meta-analysis, correct.
Yeah.
There have been 29 studies to date that have measured calorie expenditure, metabolic rate on diets differing in carbohydrate and fat content. And when you put all those studies together, or at least the first 28 together, and you look at what the overall literature says, it makes almost no difference to metabolic rate whether people are eating carbohydrate or fat. And in fact, this very small difference that it does make actually favors high carbohydrate diets. So you get a slightly higher metabolic rate when the diet is predominantly carbohydrate. Now, this study that Gary cited is the one study out of these 29 that has reported a larger effect than any others of carbohydrate restriction on energy expenditure. So this study reported an effect bigger than any of these other 28.
And the difference we would say is
Gary, I'm not done.
Gary, please.
Thank you. And interestingly, if you actually look at the data, and these data have been reanalyzed by a researcher named Kevin Hall, and if you look at the data, you find that some of the participants, some of the data that represent some of these participants are literally physically impossible. They break the first law of thermodynamics. This is the conservation of energy. Gary knows about this. He has a physics background. And they literally don't add up. And when you start subtracting the clearly erroneous data from the pool of subjects, this big effect size starts to shrink and shrink and shrink and shrink until after you've gotten rid of all of it, this study does no longer reports a higher energy expenditure on a very low carbohydrate diet, and it's consistent with the previous 28 studies that were done. So that's my perspective on that. But I want to go back to this energy.
Can I comment on
Gary,
that
you talked
study?
for a long time, and I'm going to talk for as long as I want now. I want to talk about human energy metabolism and this idea of the 10 extra calories a day. Gary, I really continue to get the feeling that you do not understand human energetics because that's not how it works.
Well, no, I'm just saying 10 calories stored in the fat tissue. That's
10
just
calories,
mathematics.
10 calories.
I didn't say anything about
Gary,
how much you have to eat.
I'm not done.
Okay, no, but you're insulting me,
Gary,
Stephan. You got to stop doing that, dude.
Gary.
You keep acting like you think I'm an idiot.
All right, are you done now? Are you done?
Can we be clear that we're talking about...
Are you done now?
Can I just finish this?
No, you can't
you
until
can't
I am
attack
done.
me without... No,
Gary,
you can't
you have
He's-
time to
he's-
respond.
You can respond, write down notes on what you want to respond to, and after he's done, you can talk
Yeah,
about
but we're
it.
going to get
Now,
into a
look,
long
study-
discourse on
Well, listen-
something that's not the point.
Well, let's
No,
find out if it is the point. We don't know what
it
he's
is
going
the
to say.
point. Thank you. Okay. Now, what you see, there's basically two things you need to pay attention to here in terms of energetics. One is the imbalance between intake and expenditure, and that is very small. So it only takes a little bit of extra calories to cause somebody to start gaining fat. However, as they gain fat, their bodies get bigger. They're gaining fat and lean mass. People with obesity have more fat, more lean mass, and their calorie needs go up and up and up and up the larger their bodies get. And so even though the imbalance between energy intake and expenditure is small, their calorie needs end up being quite a bit higher.
Can I pause for a second?
Yeah.
So you're saying that someone just gaining calories, eating additional calories, their body gains lean mass as well
Yeah, that's
as
correct.
fat?
How
So-
does the
Yep.
brain regulate that?
I didn't say it regulated
Well,
that.
hold on,
Does it
Gary,
regulate-
Gary, hold on.
That's fascinating.
But
How does the
it's
brain
muscle,
do that?
Muscle? They're gaining muscle tissue?
Some of it's muscle, some of it's
Is this
liver and
because,
organs.
okay. Is this
bone.
because they're carrying around this extra weight? And so the extra calories, and then on top of that, carrying around the extra weight forces their body to grow larger?
Presumably, I'm actually not sure what the mechanism is.
But it doesn't have anything to do with the brain. It's just a coincidence.
I don't know what it causes it. That's what I'm saying, Gary. Okay. Now, but the point is, by the time the person has obesity, they are consuming 20 to 35% more calories than they were when they were lean. So that's not just 1 or 2 Cokes a day that is allowing them to remain obese. They are consuming 20 to 35% more calories. That is what the most accurate studies are saying. And so it's not just 10 extra calories or maybe just 1 or 2 Cokes. We're talking about a substantial amount of extra calories.
But isn't this a generalization because we don't know? I mean, what's the ratio of how much fat people are how much weight people are gaining? Everybody gains a different amount of weight. Like when you're saying they're eating 20 to 30% more calories, like who is? Like how much are they gaining? Like people get fat, they get 20 pounds overweight. People get fat, they get 100 pounds overweight. I mean, it varies
Yeah, that's right.
widely.
Yeah, and that's why I give a range, because what you see is that people who are overweight, so they're in the overweight range, they just have some extra fat, they eat about 10% extra calories. People who have a little bit of obesity eat about 20% extra calories. People who have very, very great obesity eat more like 35%.
Is
so
it
it tracks
possible-
with the amount.
I'm sorry, is it possible what he was saying that if you do consume 10 extra calories over long periods of time that will accumulate?
No, it's not 10
So-
extra calories. You're
sorry.
accumulating 10
Accumulating
extra
10 extra
calories. It's like a dime is going into
It
the
is-
bank.
so
how much do you have to deposit
is
to get
correct.
the dime?
Right.
It is correct that if every day you eat 10 calories more than what you need, then yes.
Or your
That-
body
Or your body
stores.
stores, yeah, we'll say that.
That's correct.
If your body is storing 10 extra calories over top of what you need. But the thing is that as you get bigger, what you need goes up and up and up.
Because you're carrying around more weight.
Correct. And so it's 10% and 10 extra not percent, it's 10 extra calories on top of the elevated amount that you're already eating. So
Right.
you end up with these big differences in calorie
I see.
intake. So that's how it really works.